A jar sits inside a crystal urn, inside a basilica just north of Paris, holding something that should not have survived more than 2 centuries. It is a human heart, shriveled to the size of a walnut, smuggled out of a demolished prison in a handkerchief, stolen again during a riot, hidden, sold, fought over in French courts, and finally, in the year 2000, cut open by scientists with a scalpel instead of a rumor. For 200 years, an entire country had asked the same question about the boy that heart came from. Did he really die alone in a Paris tower at age 10? Or did someone smuggle him out and let another child die in his place? More than 100 separate men across 2 centuries stood up at different points in history and swore under oath in courtrooms that they were that missing boy, now grown. The answer, when it finally came, was not the one most people expected, and it ended one of the longest-running identity mysteries in European history. This isn't royalist legend or internet speculation. The child at the center of this story was Louis Charles, the second son of King Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette, a boy who briefly held the title Louis XVII after his father's execution. The scientific work that finally settled his fate was carried out by real geneticists, Jacques Cassimant and Els J. Heiss at the Center for Human Genetics at KU Leuven in Belgium, working alongside Bernd Brinkmann's forensic genetics team at the University of Münster in Germany, and their findings were published in the peer-reviewed European Journal of Human Genetics. 2 independent laboratories tested the same evidence separately, specifically so that neither team's results could be dismissed as a lab error. This was rigorous forensic science aimed at a question that had outlived every person originally involved in it. To understand why anyone needed a heart in a jar to answer this question in the first place, it helps to understand what mitochondrial DNA actually is, because it's the tool that cracked this case open. Picture a family surname, but instead of passing from father to child, it passes only from mother to child, generation after generation, almost never changing. That's roughly how mitochondrial DNA works. It sits outside the main DNA in our cells, inside tiny energy-producing structures called mitochondria. Oh, and every person inherits it exclusively from their mother, who got it from her mother in an unbroken maternal line stretching back centuries. That makes it useless for figuring out who someone's father was, but extraordinarily powerful for tracing a single maternal bloodline across generations, which happens to be exactly the kind of question a 200-year-old royal mystery requires. And there's a practical reason forensic scientists reach for mitochondrial DNA, specifically when they're working with old, degraded material, like a preserved heart or century-old bone. Every cell contains only one nucleus, and therefore only one copy of ordinary nuclear DNA, but it contains hundreds or even thousands of mitochondria, each carrying its own copy of mitochondrial DNA. When tissue has been sitting in a jar for 200 years, that abundance can be the difference between finding a usable genetic signal and finding nothing at all. Now here's where the actual story begins, and it begins with a revolution tearing a family apart. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, and the royal family's world collapsed with astonishing speed. Within 3 years, the monarchy itself had been abolished, and the family that once ruled from Versailles was imprisoned in Paris as ordinary citizens. By 1793, Louis Charles' father was dead, executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution, followed months later by his mother, Marie Antoinette, executed at the same site. The boy who would have been king was 8 years old, and revolutionary authorities locked him inside the Temple, a fortified medieval tower in Paris built centuries earlier by the Knights Templar, isolated from virtually all human contact. Guards later testified that the child was kept in near total darkness, poorly fed, and denied basic care, and within 2 years his health had catastrophically collapsed. His body reportedly covered in sores, his joints swollen, a child who had gone from the most privileged upbringing in France to conditions closer to those of a forgotten prisoner. On June 8, 1795, officials announced that the boy had died of tuberculosis. A doctor named Philippe Jean Pelletan performed the autopsy, and in a decision that would end up mattering 2 centuries later, Pelletan secretly removed the child's heart, wrapped it in a handkerchief, and smuggled it out of the building in his pocket. That single, almost impulsive act of preservation is the entire reason this mystery was ever solvable. Because almost immediately, doubt started spreading. The revolutionary government controlling Paris had every reason to obscure the details of a dead royal child's burial, and record-keeping around the event was suspiciously thin. The boy was buried in an unmarked communal grave, with no memorial, no headstone, nothing a grieving royalist could point to as proof. Within years, rumors began, circulating that the real Louis Charles had been smuggled out of the temple alive, and that a different, sickly child had been substituted in his place to die under the family name. Once that rumor took hold, it never really stopped, fed by the sheer chaos of the era. Guards were bribed constantly during the revolution. Prisoners genuinely did vanish and reappear under new identities, and the family had every reason to want the story of a surviving heir to be true. Over the following century, more than 100 separate individuals across Europe and even the Americas would step forward at different points, claiming to be the lost dauphin, all of them insisting that the boy who died in that tower wasn't really him. If a 200-year identity mystery involving smuggled body parts and imposter kings sounds like exactly the kind of history worth digging into, this is the kind of story this channel keeps coming back to. Subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Because out of the dozens of pretenders who emerged over the decades, one built by far the most convincing case, and his name was Karl Wilhelm Naundorff, a German clockmaker who surfaced in the 1810s claiming to be the escaped Louis Charles. Naundorff arrived with an oddly specific knowledge of details from inside the royal family's private life, enough that several people who had genuinely known the family in the 1780s and early 1790s came away convinced he was telling the truth. He won over supporters across Europe, gathered financial backing, and pursued his claim through French courts for decades, at one point even suing the reigning Bourbon monarchy directly for recognition of his birthright. When he died in 1845 in Delft, in the Netherlands, he was buried under the name Louis XVII, Duc de Normandie, an astonishing thing to allow on a tombstone if the claim were baseless, and a detail that kept the legend alive well into the 20th century. For generations, Naundorff's descendants continued asserting that their ancestor, not the boy who died in the temple, was the true lost king of France, and some still make that claim today. The tower's mystery might have stayed unsolved forever if not for two separate lines of physical evidence sitting almost forgotten in different countries. In the Netherlands, Naundorff's actual remains were available for testing, and in France, that walnut-sized heart, after passing through royalist hands, a Bourbon family collection in Spain, and finally the royal crypt at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, was still sitting exactly where history had left it. All that was missing was the DNA of the people who could settle the question once and for all, Marie Antoinette's own maternal relatives. That's precisely what Cassiman's team assembled, and it required tracking down genetic material scattered across more than 2 centuries in several countries. To establish what Marie Antoinette's own mitochondrial DNA signature looked like, researchers gathered preserved hair samples from the Queen herself and from 2 of her sisters, Maria Josepha and Maria Carolina, hair being one of the rare biological materials that can hold onto usable DNA across centuries, protected inside its keratin, structure long after soft tissue has broken down. They then went further, tracking down living descendants of that same unbroken maternal line, including Anna of Romania and her brother André de Bourbon-Parme, both alive at the time of testing and willing to provide blood samples for comparison. Comparing hair from an 18th century queen against DNA from her living 20th century relatives is itself a remarkable feat of genetic archaeology, and it gave scientists a confirmed maternal genetic signature to test every disputed sample against, a fixed, verified benchmark that no pretender's story could argue its way around. The first test, published in 1998, went after Naundorff. Researchers extracted mitochondrial DNA from a bone sample taken from his remains and compared it, letter by letter, against that confirmed Bourbon maternal sequence. The results were unambiguous. Naundorff's DNA differed from Marie Antoinette's sisters at 2 separate points in the sequence, and differed from the living maternal relatives at 4 separate points. 4 mismatched positions, in a sequence that should have been identical if his story were true. That is not measurement error, that is proof of an entirely different bloodline. The most famous, most legally persistent Louis XVI impostor in French history was definitively not related to the royal family at all. But debunking the most famous pretender only answered half the question. It proved Naundorff was lying. It didn't prove the boy who actually died in the temple was who officials said he was. That was a genuinely separate scientific question because, in principle, both things could have been true at once. Naundorff could have been a fraud, and the real Louis Charles could still have escaped and simply never been found, or died anonymously somewhere else entirely. Ruling out one imposter closed a chapter, but it didn't close the book. For that, scientists needed the heart itself, and in April 1999, the French government finally authorized researchers to remove 2 tissue samples from it, one from the aorta, one from the heart muscle. Each sample was split in 2, with half sent to Cassiman and Johannes' lab in Leuven, and half sent independently to Brinkman's team in Münster, so that 2 separate laboratories, working without knowledge of each other's results, would need to agree before anyone announced a conclusion. They agreed. When researchers sequenced the mitochondrial DNA extracted from the heart and lined it up against the confirmed Bourbon maternal sequence, the same reference built from Marie Antoinette's hair and her living descendants, the match was exact. Not close, not statistically probable. The consensus sequence from the heart was identical to the sequence of Marie Antoinette's maternal relatives. 2 independent labs, testing 2 independently taken samples, reached the same result, comparing every relevant position along the D-loop region of the mitochondrial genome, the specific stretch of DNA known to accumulate small variations over generations, and therefore useful for distinguishing one family line from another. Scientists announced the preliminary findings at a press conference in Paris on April 19, 2000, and the fully detailed results were published the following year in the European Journal of Human Genetics. 205 years of doubt, confirmed or dismissed by a sequence of genetic letters too short to fill a single paragraph. Let's take a breath and recap what that actually means, because it's worth sitting with. A heart, cut from a dying child's chest and smuggled out in a doctor's handkerchief in 1795, survived a revolution, a riot in 1830 that gutted the building it was stored in, an event so violent that eyewitnesses described the palace as stripped down to bare walls, an international relocation to Spain, and 2 more centuries of handling, and it still held enough intact genetic material to answer a question that had outlived every single person who lived through the original event. Meanwhile, the most convincing pretender in the entire 200-year saga, the one who'd fought for legal recognition in French courts and died believing his own claim enough to have it carved on his own tombstone, carried DNA from a completely unrelated family line. Here's where it gets even more interesting, though, because Naundorff's story didn't quite end there either. In the years that followed, some of Naundorff's remaining supporters didn't fully concede. A French researcher named Gerard Lucat published follow-up work in 2014, arguing that Naundorff's mitochondrial DNA belonged to the same broader haplogroup, essentially the same large genetic family branch, as the confirmed royal maternals. Line, and separately claimed a partial Y chromosome match with a living Bourbon descendant. To be clear about what that actually shows, sharing a broad haplogroup with millions of other Europeans is not the same as sharing a specific maternal ancestor. And Lucat's own analysis reportedly put the odds of Naundorff and the Bourbons sharing a common ancestor around the year 1300 at roughly 50%, a coincidence explainable by ordinary European genetic background, rather than direct royal descent. The original 1998 and 2001 findings, with their precise position-by-position sequence, mismatches against Marie Antoinette's own confirmed relatives, remain the scientific consensus. Population-level genetic overlap and a specific, provable maternal bloodline are 2 very different standards of evidence, and only one of them was ever met here. If you've made it this far into a story about a smuggled royal heart, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is made for, so if you haven't already, now's a good moment to hit subscribe. Because the ending of this story isn't really about vindicating a doctor's decision to steal a child's heart in the chaos of revolutionary Paris, even though that decision is precisely why any of this could ever be answered. It's about what happens when 200 years of rumor, legal battles, forged identities, and desperate hope finally collide with a technology nobody in 1795 could have imagined. It's worth being precise about what this evidence does and doesn't establish, because DNA testing is powerful, but it isn't magic. And a responsible telling of this story has to hold both the strength of the finding and its real limits at the same time. The mitochondrial match confirms that the heart belonged to someone who shared Marie Antoinette's unbroken maternal bloodline, a Bourbon on the maternal side, consistent with being her son. Mitochondrial DNA on its own cannot single-handedly prove this specific heart came from this specific 10-year-old boy, rather than some other maternal relative entirely, because mitochondrial DNA is shared identically by an entire maternal lineage, not just one individual within it. A sibling, a maternal cousin, or another relative along the same line would carry the identical sequence. That's precisely why historians and geneticists lean on the DNA evidence together with a documented, continuous chain of custody. Pelletan's own account of the autopsy and the theft, the recorded handoffs through Bourbon hands in Spain, and the heart's eventual traceable placement at Saint-Denis, rather than the genetics alone. Chain of custody plus a maternal DNA match taken together is what actually closes the case. Either one by itself would leave room for doubt, and this evidence conclusively rules Naundorff out as a blood relative. It cannot, by itself, retroactively prove every detail of what happened inside the temple during the boy's final 2 years, or rule out every conceivable alternative scenario with the absolute certainty people sometimes assume DNA provides. What it can say, at the population and family level, with the highest degree of confidence forensic genetics allows, is this: the DNA is consistent with the official history and inconsistent with the imposter's story, exactly opposite to what generations of romantic legend had assumed. So the boy in the tower really was who the guards said he was, not a substitute, not a decoy smuggled in to protect a hidden heir, a frightened, isolated 10-year-old who lived his final years in the dark and died of an illness that had nothing to do with conspiracy, whose heart was pulled from his chest by a doctor who may have sensed, even then, that history would eventually need proof. It took 205 years, 2 independent laboratories on 2 sides of a national border, a preserved lock of a dead queen's hair, and living relatives scattered across Europe who had no idea their own blood would one day close a case that outlived every king it touched. Somewhere between a demolished tower and a jar in a basilica, an entire folklore tradition of secret escapes and hidden heirs quietly gave way to the far stranger, far sadder truth. There was no escape, no substitution, no decades-long secret, just a lonely child and a doctor's small act of theft that turned out to matter more than anyone alive in 1795 could have guessed. So here's what's worth sitting with. Knowing that the most convincing, most legally persistent imposter in this entire saga carried mismatched DNA at not 1, but 4 separate points in the sequence, and knowing that the actual proof came down to a heart smuggled out in a doctor's handkerchief in 1795. Which one of those 2 facts changes how you think about this story? Tell me in the comments, and let me know if you want to follow up on the other royal DNA mystery the same lab helped solve a few years later, the identification of Napoleon's own remains,